Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. I'm Charles Williams, and together we'll explore untold stories, bold ideas, and innovative approaches that transform our schools and communities. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Counter Narrative Podcast. As always, thank you so much for rejoining me in this space, whether you're listening or watching or doing a hybrid of the two. Well, obviously, if you're watching, you're also listening. It'd be really weird if you were watching and not listening. But thank you so much for rejoining me in this space. We go throughout these journeys, I get to bring in number of guests from different spaces, right? And I've always shared with you, sometimes I have shared space with these people, whether it's on stage or we've done a workshop together, or sometimes they are brand new to me, but doing similar work. And so I get to expand my EduCrew network. And so I'm really excited because this guest today falls into that last category. And so as we were talking pre-show, one of the things that she had mentioned reminded me of a question that I bring up during one of our workshops. And this one is during the Equitable Leadership Workshop. And I oftentimes tell people, think about the groups in your school, whether it's your staff or your students or your spaces, think about them and note the groups that just came to mind. And now I want you to think about the ones that you didn't come to mind. What were those groups that you have forgotten about, those individuals that exist within your space, but so oftentimes are flying under the radar or sometimes are even completely off the radar? And so I think we're going to be having a very similar conversation, which makes me very excited. So before I go any further, I just want to introduce all of you to Maggie Broderick. Maggie, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, thanks so much, Charles. It's great to be here. It's 2025. Can't believe it. So it's great to
Yes,
chat with you tonight. Thanks for having me.
of course. Thank you so much for joining. So Maggie, before we jump in to this conversation, because I really am looking forward to diving into this concept, tell us a little bit about who you are, whatever aspects of your journey that you want to share, the work that you're currently doing, and maybe the journey that got you to this point.
Sure. Well, I'm a teacher at heart. That's what you'll hear me say on any time that you hear me on a podcast or in some of my writings and lots of different things. I like to do that in many different ways. So I became a teacher officially in 1993, feels like a long time ago, and I taught elementary general music. But it was at a German magnet school. So in the city of Pittsburgh, we have these programs, and I also, speak German and am certified in German. So at that time, for most of the '90s, I was teaching, German folk songs and doing musical ensembles and choral groups, and I loved that. But as time goes on, our roles change. I became a mom. I've got three kiddos. Two are now grown-ups. I can't believe it. And one is a teenager. And, I feel like in that there's a lot of teaching as well. So that heart of a teacher, as a Girl Scout troop leader and things like that. But then over time, I did get my PhD in teaching foreign languages at the University of Pittsburgh, and online teaching came into sort of, its beginnings. Oh, maybe 2008 or so. So I've been teaching online now, mostly graduate students since about that time. Gosh, more than 15 years now. And most of my time is as a dissertation chair. So I do work with a lot of people getting their doctorate degree in education in all kinds of different realms. And I also run at National University what we call our Advanced Research Center. It's ARC, where we help people, whether they're students, faculty, alumni, or staff, work on presentations and publications. So if they're wanting to go do scholarly work, maybe they just finished their PhD. Like, what do I do next? So I help them with that. We do a lot of ways to sort of network them together and help them find, where do I do these sorts of things. And I do a lot of other work there too. I love working at National, and we have a very strong focus on social emotional learning. So I am actually one of our many people who has a lead role with SEL there as well.
Very nice, very nice. And I perked up when you mentioned German. So my grandmother was a hybrid of different European ethnicities, descents, but she spoke German, and that is when we knew that she was being very serious because she would oftentimes say something, and then when we heard Mach schnell, we knew like, hey, we've got to move it. And so it's always fun whenever I hear that. They're very strong, and I know sometimes when I meet people, they're like, really, German background? I was like, yeah, my grandfather, Michael Patrick O'Reilly, tons of Irish there. So, but
Yeah.
loving that background. So thank you so much for sharing. And so I'm curious as we're diving into this, because you've had this journey in education. As you mentioned, you started as a teacher in '93, and so you've had this time in various roles. What is it that you want to focus on today?
Well, one thing that resonated with me even as a very young, early 20s brand new teacher, and today as a parent, and also as somebody working in sort of more research in the field of education, it's about students who maybe you're not realizing if they're not having a sense of belonging, where are they finding that in the PK through 12 school? Really important when we think about social emotional learning, that idea of a sense of belonging. How do I find my tribe? Where do I find my people? Where do I, go if I'm having a bad day or a good day or anything within that school? And we're talking about a huge, swath of learners, right? PK, maybe 3 or 4 years old, all the way through high school. But I think a lot, particularly about places maybe in, a middle school or a high school, if a kid is kind of having maybe a rough time, who's that teacher that they turn to, or what is special for them that, they actually want to go to school the next day. They actually wake up and go, okay, this is good. I have a place here. And one thing that I'm really looking at a lot is I previously wrote a book chapter, actually right around the pandemic start time, rough time. And but it sort of resonated because it touched on this just a little bit. And it was about what I coined as less commonly taught content areas. And so basically, there are those little nooks in the school. For example, I had anecdotes in that chapter from someone who is a Russian teacher. And you wouldn't think of that as a really common thing, but he is able to make this beautiful sort of oasis for the students. Some of them, from all different, very, diverse backgrounds in this particular school. He teaches, refugees and LGBTQ students and all kinds of things. And many of them converge in this special space. So when I read his story and many others, I thought, we need to say more about this. So I'm writing another book chapter now, and also with sort of those insights, as we've come through the pandemic and other difficult times, in our country and in the world. Where are those special places for people in our PK through 12 schools? Sometimes that hidden oasis is the band room, the orchestra room, the art room. Sometimes it's a special sport or some physical education experience. I'm a marching band person. I'm not a sports person, but I can imagine you could find a special place there, or a language class. It's all kinds of different places, which it might not be your core content areas, but sometimes they're overlooked and sort of off in a corner. But beautiful things are happening in those spaces. So I'm trying to bring together some research literature and maybe dive in a bit more to those stories about those places.
Man, I absolutely love it. And I love the idea that you call these spaces oases, right? Because yeah, like I may find that is my safe space. I may find connections there. And in fact, one of the workshops that I talk about in the Resilience Champs framework, that's the C, it's connection. And you talked about SEL, and that is a critical component of having like-minded people, being able to build those relationships. And maybe I can't do it in other spaces, but I have found that oasis within the school where I'm able to do so, but maybe because it's not as popular, maybe because it's not maybe connecting. And I'm curious, like obviously this is true. And I think many of us as we're thinking about this, we might connect to a space like that. Because I know growing up, I was in theater, right? I
Yeah.
tell people I was like the Troy Bolton. Yeah, I was on the football field, but I also enjoyed being on stage and being in the theater. And so those are two different areas, but that theater was my oasis. And the theater kids were oftentimes the weird kids. Like I remember, being called that. I remember having that label in theater, kind of, like we're gonna scrounge together scraps in order to put on our production because there's no budget for theater.
Right.
So I'm
Right.
curious, in your experience, as you've been doing this research, as you've been doing this work, just even connecting with other people, like why do you think this is? Why do you think there are these oases, these pockets that kind of are off to the side and not necessarily included in the mainstream of things?
I think there's a lot of things at play, and I think I'm just starting to touch the surface there. I would like to see people looking at this a lot, and even also in online learning. I've kind of looked in that, like, what's happening in those spaces? There's so
Mhm.
much to uncover. But I think we often in this country and many other places will say, okay, what are our test scores? How are we doing in math, right? And that's super important. I've got two STEM kids. I've got three children. One is a musical theater kid, my teenager. They actually go to a special school, a magnet school here in the city for musical theater and vocal and singing and things, and it's fantastic. And the other two, are STEM kids. Hey, yeah, I'm like, yeah, awesome. You're doing your math. One's going to be an engineer. I'm like, that's great. But at the same time, there are other things in the school where we will cut that budget, unfortunately,
Right.
for this sort of thing of having higher test scores, for this thing of having oh, we just brought up our SAT scores by 10% or something. But I feel like that's really, unfortunately, messing things up, actually making things worse. I think when we have these spaces, that's why the kids, show up there the next day. I know for me, I was a very shy child, but I played the flute and I did well with that. And every day I thought, I've got band today. Sure, I can suffer through this other thing that I'm not enjoying all that much, or maybe I'm having some kind of social issues, or there's bullying, lots of things.
Mhm.
But if I go to band, I'm going to feel pretty good today. I saw the same thing happen with my son. He did end up majoring in computer science, but he is very openly trans man. And he and I've talked about this a lot, and I've mentioned him on my podcast, things I've done and webinars. And through the years, his art class was the place, both in school and in a special after school program that he was part of, where he felt comfortable in that. As his gender exploration continued. And so when we think about people who are, going through a lot of things with social emotional stuff, sometimes just having that place is worth more than we can even put into 10% improvement on our SAT scores or something. And at the same time, probably actually helps our SAT scores. We just don't seem to find ways to back that research up well enough sometimes. But I do think focusing on that sense of belonging, I mean, we want attendance to go up. We want people to be in school. We want them to be happy in school. And we have very diverse populations. So having some place for everyone where they have that teacher who's like, hey, this is where you can come if you're having a bad day, a good day, or whatever. I think it helps all the outcomes, social, emotional, academic, and otherwise.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on an important piece there. I've spent my entire career in Title I schools, and you're absolutely right. The conversations have always been around two subject areas: ELA, reading specifically, and math. And right, because those are the things that are getting measured. Those are the things then obviously that are important. And we have a myriad of quotes and phrases and things around that echo that sentiment. And yeah, you're right. All these other things are not necessarily important. We want to know, can our kids read? Can they compute mathematics? And right, if we're pouring money into programs around that, and I'm sorry, I don't have money for foreign language or for fine arts or for other things, too bad, too sad. But I think you're hitting on something powerful, is that as we talk about holistic education, and I think we try to supplement this with other pieces, but then yet we're so quick to get rid of all of these other components. And so I think that you touched on a very important piece there that I would be curious to dive into. And I'm sure there's research somewhere. I'm sure that right, but maybe it doesn't necessarily promote right some of the decisions that are being made.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and it's unfortunate because we really, we really try to do what's best. I don't think anybody has bad intentions there, but unfortunately, we end up cutting things, and languages, music, these things are gone first in the budget.
Yeah, I'll share with you, and I'm sure those of you who've listened to the show, you've heard this story before. And in fact, I just found it, so I cannot wait. I'm gonna drop it on social media soon. But I oftentimes share this story about, um, as I just mentioned, we were a Title I school. I was a principal at an elementary school, and we had science classes, but we didn't have much of it, right? It was like, all right, we're going to dedicate X amount of time to do some science, but then keep it moving into these big blocks of reading and math. And so to supplement, we had a teacher who said, I'm going to start a STEM club, an after school
Mhm.
STEM club. And nobody ever signed up. We had a sign up sheet.
Ah,
It sat empty. And so I remember one time I was at a meeting and they had mentioned in this meeting that there was a Boeing rocket building competition. It was a competition hosted by Boeing. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, when is that? And they were like, well, sorry, the invites already went out. And I was like, yeah, like, where mine probably got lost in the mail. So where are we sending my kids? They're like, no, in Charlottetown. I said, no, it was lost in the mail, right? Like, I believe in advocacy. And I was like, you're not going to ignore us on this one. And so
That's right.
I remember we sent a group of students out, and they were so angry with me because they were like, you're setting us up for failure. We don't even have a science class, and yet you want us to go to this rocket building competition. And I remember there were a group of eighth graders, and I remember there was this one student who was always tinkering. I mean, this kid would just bring in
Yeah.
scrap metal and stuff, and just during lunch, that's all he would do. He would tinker. He was trying to build like a cyborg arm. He would be. I was like, "What are you?" Right? But that was his thing, right? And again, we didn't have necessarily a space, but that was his oasis. And I remember when the kids were building their team, they said, "We want you," and he was kind of like, "Me?
Yeah.
Like, nobody ever really talks to me. Nobody ever includes me. Why do you want me?" And they're like, "This is your thing." And so they went
Yeah.
off. And I'll be honest, Maggie, like when they left, I was really like, I put on a brave face when they were in the building. But when they left, I was like, have I really set them up for absolute dismal failure? And I remember waiting for the bus to pull up. And when it pulled up, they came bounding off the bus, super excited. They
Oh.
had won third place. And what they told me, I wasn't there, so I'm going to believe them. But they said the first time they fired the rocket, it went beyond what was the parameters and actually hit the barrier they had and damaged the rocket. And they were like, that's why we came in third, because it didn't fly as
Uh,
well later on. So the
oh my
next year,
goodness.
right? Like I was like, okay, I mean, fine, you came in third, which surpassed all my expectations. So the
Yeah.
next year, my invite wasn't lost in the mail.
Right?
Surprising. But they said you can't bring back the same group. And I said, don't worry, they were eighth graders, they're gone. But, they said you got to bring in fifth graders. That's fine. So we sent off two groups of fifth graders. And one group came back. They had won the entire thing. A group of little black girls won the entire thing from
There
all
you
of
go.
these
Yeah.
schools all across of Chicago. And you're right. The next day, that STEM list was filled, right? Because
Yep.
now it was
Yep.
suddenly I had an argument to say we can create an oasis here, right? Because
Yes,
before
that's
that I
it. That's
didn't.
it.
So I wanted to share that
Yes.
story because I love that phrase, finding the oasis.
Oh, thank you. And that's a perfect example. I mean, and then just think about it. Those girls are coming to school every day. They're coming back to their community and saying, look what we did. This is cool. And there is this culture of that happening. And that's what helped me as a musician, when there was a culture of that, like, wow, that's pretty cool that you can do that. Didn't have to be, and I didn't want to be the head of the football team or anything like that, the captain. I just, wanted it to be like, hey, that's pretty awesome. And there are so many different things. You can have many different types of, oases so to speak. So yeah, I think we need to delve more into this. I think we need to think, I mean, I think it's fantastic to win the competition, but even to just go and experience it, that experience is so important. So sometimes these things are more qualitative than quantitative. And I think sometimes we go a little too quantitative with our measures for education. So it's important. We don't want to totally get rid of it. I've seen places that do. Don't want to get rid of that either, but we need to bring in some things that are a little harder to measure because they're really valuable.
Yeah, no, I definitely think yet another good conversation, right? The quantitative, qualitative. But I'm curious, and it sounded like you had a robust program that you had the fantastic opportunity to be able to sit and have and build up this German music program, which I'm thinking when I was in high school, I remember there was a German language class, which I've not heard about a German language class, let alone a German music program, right? We can barely hang on to having a music program, within our school right now. So I'm curious whether it was from your own experience, if you ever had to go through something like this, or maybe somebody's listening to this right now and they're thinking, I think my spot is an oasis space. Right? We're not the big
Mhm.
popular space in the building. We're not the one who's really getting funding. Maybe they're having second thoughts or some doubts. Like whether it was from your own experience or maybe just somebody watching or listening to this right now, do you have any ideas, suggestions to say, like, how can you preserve that oasis, especially when we're talking about we're existing in times when these budgets are being cut, when these become those targets of those cuts?
Yeah, yeah, and that really touches on a super important part of the book that I'm working on, the book chapter. So the entire book is about multi-tiered systems of support and trauma-informed educational practices. And my colleague is the editor. Her name's Jen Aniano, and I'm just one of the contributing chapters. But in my chapter at the very end, I am really, really touching on some things about preserving those educators who are sort of making this happen. So the social emotional aspects, thinking about trauma informed educational practices, and working within MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, so that this teacher is part of a system. They're not doing it all by themselves. They're not providing all the emotion labor, because it's mostly sort of in my head and looking at the research and things like that now, and these anecdotes that I collected in 2021, that it's sort of a little squishy, but the idea is really that a lot of emotion labor is put on these folks. So if you are that one teacher who is being the person who has the oasis for other folks, my feeling is that you're probably going to have more, you know, burnout and issues where you need to be supported as well. So I'm hoping to look into that a little further. I'm hoping to do more research to say, hey, what is it like if you are getting support from administration, from parents, from community? Does the oasis get bigger? If you are not, does it, unfortunately not survive? And I do feel like if the teacher isn't getting sort of the emotional support that they need, then how can they give it to the students in that particular oasis? So that's what I'm thinking about as next steps. Not there yet, but that's kind of where I'm headed.
So tell me a little bit. So you've mentioned this book. Does it have a working title? Does it have a title yet?
Well, I'll leave it to my friend because she is
Okay.
the editor. But her name is Jen Aniano, and she's terrific. Dr. Aniano, also from National University. Maybe you want to talk to her sometime as well.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know she's collecting many chapters about multi-tiered systems of support, trauma-informed educational practices, and just sort of where we are right now in PK through 12. Mine is just one of those stories, but love the approach there that she's really thinking about. Everybody in the school collaborating, which is really what I think needs to happen. I mean, music teacher might be running a whole band program, by themselves, but you also need the whole community there supporting that teacher, and you need the administration supporting that teacher, and they need to have their emotional needs, met so that they can give what they're giving to all of those students who are coming to that program.
Yeah, as you were mentioning just a few moments ago, and you were talking about MTSS, and you were talking about SEL, and I was just thinking about my own experiences. I was thinking about the spaces that we're in, and I've shared oftentimes in this space here on this podcast, as well as in others, just my growing uh, battle, I guess, with our approach to SEL within our schools right now. This idea that when we talk about SEL, when we talk about social emotional learning, we know that it is very individualized. It has to be because it's the core of the concept, and yet we tend to adopt programs, right? These kind of cookie cutter programs, and say, okay, well, everybody's going to get the same thing. I think
Right.
oftentimes we're asking educators who are not qualified, who have not been trained to do some of this work. Things are unpacked, and it's like, well, what do I do with that now? And it's like, I don't know. That's in the next chapter. We'll look at that
Right.
tomorrow. And
Right.
we're left, kids are walking around with this on cover trauma and not knowing what to do with it. And
Yes.
I think as you were touching on and we were talking about and just kind of bringing it back to the beginning of this conversation, maybe that's not necessarily the way to address the trauma, right? You were mentioning the MTSS, those systems of support. And we know it's academic and behavioral, but maybe
Right.
if I just simply had a place, right, where was seen, valued, that I could contribute, my ideas and person was honored as is, maybe, just maybe, we wouldn't have to worry so much about finding a program to
Right.
address all of those other things. And so it's like maybe your oasis is the new SEL. Like maybe,
Oh, I love that. I just love the idea that people want to come to school the next day, right? I mean, I can
right,
tell you, my three kids and me also way back in the 80s, right? I can remember you wake up one morning, you go, I cannot, right? And I've seen that with my kids, like I cannot today. Well, why can you not? And when you can, it's beautiful. Like, yeah, I'm going to school, hooray! I love my drama class. I love my music
yeah,
class. I love whatever the case may be. I'm learning a language, and really doing great with that, and it's super cool. And I made a friend who speaks the language, whatever the thing is. STEM, robots, whatever, that sort of thing, that sense of belonging and the sense of self-worth, it just ties in directly. I can see a Venn diagram in my head with SEL. Like it just totally ties in. Sense of belonging is super important.
Yeah, I've never heard a kid saying, "I cannot wait to get to school to finish that next module within the SEO program." Like that is probably
No,
not
not
a
so
thing.
much. Not so much. Yep. Yeah, they need a place where they just are, it's motivation, right? We did a,
Absolutely.
a book a while back. My colleague Amy Lynn is an expert in SEL, like really has lived a life of this throughout 30 years. And we partnered on a book and had many chapters in that book. And it was motivation and momentum in adult online learners. And so that was the idea, like what is engaging and what is motivating and what keeps them going. Because like if we're talking about an adult, they're busy and
Mhm.
maybe they're trying to do a doctorate and all the stuff is exhausting and stressful, but if they get up every day and go, gosh darn it, I want to do this, that's what we want to see. And it's hard sometimes. So any kind of engaging, motivating things that say, I want to be there and I feel a sense of belonging and I'm happy to do this today is what we want to see.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of what we've talked about today is going to resonate with our listeners, with the viewers. This idea to say, hey, how can I just amplify the oasis? How can I bring this to light and show those impacts, right? Show the benefits, however it might be. And I would argue those of you in those spaces right now, fight for that space, fight for it
Yes.
because the impact that you have, maybe you don't necessarily realize it, maybe you've grown tired, but I'm sure, and Maggie has already shared this, that you are probably having a bigger impact than you possibly know.
Yep. Yep. I agree 100%.
So, Maggie, as we get ready to close out, I told you this time flies by so quickly. So maybe somebody wants to learn more about the work that you do, right? Finding one of these books that you've already contributed to, or keeping an eye out for the book that is going to be dropping at some point in the future. How can they find you? How can they connect with you?
Sure. Well, I'm at National University, so it's just my email. I don't mind at all if folks email mbroderick, Maggie Broderick, mbroderick at nu.edu. And then I do have LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, pretty easy to find me there. And then if you really want to be a little bit more nerdy about it, looking for book chapters and research and all these sorts of things, there's this page that you may know about called ResearchGate. It's sort of like a Facebook for researchers. So if you look me up on ResearchGate, you'll see once this is all said and done, anything I write or present generally goes up there.
Wonderful. Yeah, I don't think I'm too familiar with ResearchGate, but now, not that I just need yet another space in my life, but
Right.
who knows? I'll go join, check it out, find you, see some of the work that you're doing. So Maggie, I just want to say thank you, obviously for jumping on the show. I know that we tried, it didn't work. We've got you back on, so I'm glad so much that you're able to be here. But also just thank you for doing this work, and I think that you have really elevated tonight a topic that needs to be said, needs to be heard, and there's a few gems there. I love these ideas of, protecting those oases. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me and all the work you're doing. I love it, and just have a wonderful year as we have 2025.
Absolutely. You do the same. And to all of my viewers, all of those who are watching right now, as always, until next time.